Narrative mirroring, in the context of today's video, is a storytelling technique in which the story of one character is essentially used to either represent the backstory or future story of another character, and the goal in today's video is to find out whose story represents whose present story was once somebody's backstory, and whose future story is bound to become somebody in the present story. However, as mentioned by Pooh in Season 4, when he says the world going one way and people another, implies that despite the cycle of the game repeating itself, the humans aren't so much doing the same, and that the players of today are far worse than the players of the past. And so it isn't as simple as just labelling Michael Lee the next Omar Little, as frankly such isn't the case. Sure, they share similarities, however those brought up in Season 4 are bound to become much more monstrous than those brought up before Season 1.
Game the same, just got more fierce.
Michael Lee's reason for turning to the streets was because he had to fend for his little brother Bug. He stomached all sorts of horror, just so he could save his younger brother from a life of pain. On the surface, Michael Lee is a morally commendable individual. However, if you look deeper, you'll learn that aside from the murder of Junebug, Michael doesn't have much of a problem soldiering for a stone-cold killer involved in the murder of innocents. And it's only when Marlowe comes after him that Michael parts ways from a life of murdering whoever he's told, to the life that he leads now of ripping and running. He then sacrifices a relationship with his brother, just to make sure he remains safe as Michael is once again forced to continue his journey into the streets. To put it plainly, Michael may share the same occupation as Omar, but he sure doesn't share the same reasoning or moral code. You see, unlike Michael, Omar was the little brother. However, he unfortunately didn't share the same luxury as Bug, as his older brother in No Heart Anthony, for whatever reason, couldn't shield Omar from the streets. And I believe this to be the major difference when comparing Michael's story to Omar's. You see, Omar was fortunate enough to not have to care for a dependent as well as himself, and so from an early age, he would have had the opportunity to be a little more flexible with his morality. Survival weren't so much of an issue, as it was only himself he had to look out for. However, Michael was a total opposite. Where Omar had some leniency in deciding who he robbed and killed, Michael had to do whatever he was ordered for the sake of his little brother. And so to say that Michael's story was simply Omar Little's backstory isn't quite true, and I would actually argue Michael's story to closer resemble that of Omar's older brothers, No Heart Anthony. However, that isn't to say that Michael's future is at all going to look like that of Anthony's, or Omar's for that matter. Rather, I would argue him to more be in the middle of the two, a stick-up man much less merciful than those who came before him.
Look at you, not even blinking.
Out of all the corner boys, Namond Brice was the one fortunate enough to both be shielded and eventually saved from a life on the streets, as Namond was lucky enough to be related to Wee Bay Brice, somebody whose name rung out so loud that his son were able to get away with much many couldn't. Take for example the time he slacked off when working under Bodie, where many would have found themselves out of work. Namond finds himself up for promotion. However, having strong relations isn't always a benefit, especially in the world of The Wire, as with strong relations also comes strong expectations. If you're the son of a ruthless soldier, then you're expected to become somewhat similar. However, it takes the death of D'Angelo Barksdale for Namond's father to realise that just because one shares blood with a killer doesn't mean they themselves are going to be one. You can't expect somebody shielded from the consequences of the game to treat such as though their life depends on it, essentially saying that you can't teach Namond to play the game as though his life is on the line, as you could say Michael Lee, whose life is actually on the line. The story of Namond Brice is essentially the backstory of D'Angelo Barksdale. Both were raised by mothers who pushed for them to become like their relatives, and both were protected from the game by said relatives, leaving us with two extremely emotional men, not cut out for the role they're expected to play. And if it weren't for Bunny Colvin, Namond's future story would have wound up looking like that of D'Angelo Barksdale's. However, because he was seemingly saved, an intriguing question arises. Who does Namond Brice turn into? And the answer to this question is a morally commendable version of Clay Davis. You see, there are numerous parallels to Namond and Clay over the course of the show, the most obvious being the I'll take anybody's money line. However, to me, the comparison that solidified these two is how they act different depending on who they're around. Clay Davis is all temper tantrum when behind closed doors, yet happy-go-lucky when around those he feels he needs to impress. And this is exactly how Namond acts. He's all street and trying to show off when around his peers, yet softens up when around people like Carver and Bunny. Now, this isn't to say that Namond is going to grow up to become a corrupt politician, as such would suggest that Bunny's teachings only take him so far. And such a comparison also misses one of the points Sawyer tries to make, which is that people aren't so much separated by mentality as they are by opportunity. There are those in the government who have the mentality of those on the street, and there are those in the street who have the mentality of those in the government. Everybody is separated by opportunity. Clay has the mentality of a player, despite being lucky enough to find himself a part of the government. And Namond has the same mentality as Clay, yet is saved by Bunny Colvin, essentially saying that Clay Davis is who Namond Brice would become, if not for Bunny Colvin. Kenard is one of a few characters on The Wire, with the ability to see things exactly as they are. And what I mean by this, is that when Omar Little is seen hobbling through Baltimore, where many might run in fear, as they see the man who took on both Avon and Marlowe, Kenard simply sees Omar for what he truly is, an emperor with no clothes, which is part of the reason why he's able to do what many couldn't, as it wasn't so much skill that was stopping the average Joe from popping one in Omar's back, more than it was fear. However, such an ability isn't always a benefit, as what I've described is essentially just the ability to commit senseless violence without filter. You'll kill whoever you feel like killing, regardless of whether or not they're a player or police, which ultimately ends up in Kenard going to jail, where I imagine he'll only become much worse. To answer the video's title, the backstory of Kenard, as well as his future story, I believe somewhat resembles that of Bird's, which isn't so much surprising, as the two are heavily hinted at to be parallels throughout the show. Both disregard the rules of the organisation they work for, Bird getting high on his own supply, and Kenard simply robbing the supply. They both have a knack for senseless violence, Bird willing to attack police, and Kenard willing to burn a cat. And they both harbour a deep hatred for gay people, with Bird mocking both Omar and Kima for their sexuality, and Kenard acting disgusted when asked by Namond for an opinion on his ponytail.
Yo, how you think I look with no tail on my head?
Do I look like a faggy?
I would also imagine Kenard to hold the gun he used on Omar in the highest of regards, flaunting it to all those who'll listen, exactly like how Bird flashed his gun around to people in the projects. Ultimately, they're both ruthless killers who care little for both the law and the rules of those they work for. Soldiers soldiering just for the sake of causing pain. Coupled with the fact that they both look identical, Kenard is almost definitely the next Bird.
Bird trifling, basically. Killing everyday working man and all.
Who got him?
Some young boy.
Who?
Ain't heard the name, don't even know if there was a why. Hop on one of hip-hop, see the damage, you know?
The fate of Randy Wagstaff, for some reason, was left far more ambiguous than all the other corner boys. There are those who believe he becomes the next Bodie, those who believe he becomes the next Prop Joe, and even those who believe he becomes the next Marlowe Stanfield. However, if we look at the facts, Randy could best be described as an individual capable of running a store, an individual who through no fault of his own finds himself involved in the business of others, and finally somebody who confesses to the police at the first sign of trouble. If you haven't yet figured it out, Randy Wagstaff shares a near identical storyline to that of Old-Face Andre. They both run a store, both find themselves being used as a middleman where a crime takes place. Andre the witness who saw Omar murder a delivery lady, and Randy the lookout whilst two boys and a girl have sex in the school bathroom. Both situations eventually go tits up due to a change in story. Omar tells Bunk what really happened at the store, and the girl claims she was raped instead of it being consensual. Ultimately, both Andre and Randy find themselves in the line of fire all because of another person's doing, and they both talk to the police in an attempt to dodge the firing squad. Now that isn't to say that the future story of Randy is bound to look like that of Old-Face Andre's. Rather, Randy's story, I believe, somewhat resembles that of Old-Face Andre's backstory. However, where Randy seemingly learnt the importance behind not talking to the police, Old-Face Andre didn't.
Roger said you was my escort out.
Manner speaking, that be true.
As described by Carver, Randy isn't so much a bad kid, rather he just shows bad judgment, which is exactly how I would describe Old-Face Andre. He isn't a terrible person like those he works for, rather he's just poor with how he handles business outside of his shop. I believe Randy will one day find himself in a position similar to Andre's, especially now as the inheritor of his uncle's shop given Cheese's death. However, I don't see him ever amounting to much more, especially not to the level of his uncle Prop Joe, who's actually almost the total opposite of his nephew when it comes to how he deals with business. Where Joe will make sure he's as far away from the chaos as possible, Randy somehow manages to pit himself right in the middle of it. Just because you buy for $1 and sell for $2 doesn't make you the genius that is Prop Joe. The story of Dookie Weems is most obviously meant to represent the backstory of Bubbles. However, the point I want to make when it comes to Dookie's story is that just because Dookie becomes a drug addict doesn't mean he's going to become the next Bubbles. And the same applies to all the other characters. Just because their stories end up looking like the beginning of somebody else's doesn't mean they're going to become that exact person, or even that their futures will play out in a similar fashion. Where Bubbles had a home to go back to in his sister, Dookie had nothing. And so just because you see him as a junkie come the end of the show, doesn't mean that his future is going to play out like that of Bubbles. The point is that you get an idea of how a person like Bubbles can end up in his unique situation, not so much that Dookie is to become the next Bubbles.